In the snowy silence of Maple Creek, Vermont, a reclusive veteran named Jack Turner welded sculptures from broken steel while whispers in town painted him as a dangerous ghost. But when a child fled from his scarred face and a wounded dog appeared at his door, Jack's fortress began to crack. What followed was a journey through betrayal, buried letters, and an unexpected redemption that the town never saw coming. Stay with us to uncover the truth behind the Night Watcher. And if this story moves, you don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Jack Turner measured his mornings the way a machinist measures a thread: slow, steady, exact. He woke before dawn because the dark still felt honest brewed coffee in a dented percolator that hissed like a small locomotive, and stood by the narrow window of his metal shop to watch the world decide whether to keep its silence. The shop sat at the dead end of a cracked county road tucked against a line of bare maples and a wind-swept field that turned the color of hammered tin in November light. The corrugated steel walls held the night's cold in their bones. The space smelled of old oil and clean metal sparks and winter. If you drove past on Route 7 and caught a sliver of it, low roof welded sign, a rusted vise bolted to an outdoor bench, you might have thought the place abandoned. That suited Jack. The shop was his stronghold, and his apology the one place he could trust what heat and pressure would do. He hung his tools in straight, patient rows, each wrench facing the same direction, each socket set gleaming like coins. On the clean rectangle of his workbench, he lined 2 chalk marks and a tape measure, then ran a knuckle along the edge of a plate he'd cut the night before. He didn't keep a radio. Noise had a way of multiplying. The only voices he allowed were the ones trapped in steel grinders, the soft tick of cooling welds, the whisper of his own breath when he forgot he was holding it. By 7, the furnace had settled into its hum, and the pale light had pushed up over the ridge. Jack fed a bar of mild steel into the vise and cranked the handle until the jaws bit down. He didn't think of himself as a sculptor. He thought of himself as someone who understood what stubborn things needed to bend. When the torch caught a small blue star bloomed, and he lowered his goggles as if bowing to a ritual he privately despised. He was a man of rituals now. He hadn't been once. Back then, he answered to rank and orders, to impossible deadlines drawn on maps that didn't match the ground beneath a boot. It was the ground that had taught him always the ground stubborn and untrusting. The years since had shaved him down to essentials: the coffee, the shop, the drive into town when he couldn't put it off, and the rules he made because rules were easier to obey when you wrote them yourself. Rule 1. Keep your head down. Rule 2. Do not invite ghosts. Rule 3. Do not speak unless you have to. The torch traced a line that glowed orange and then dulled. He set the piece aside, took the goggles off, and wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist. The wall clock stuttered forward, a small, nervous movement, as if time itself were clearing its throat. He glanced up and saw the minute hand click into place, 8:15. He had an appointment. He didn't call an appointment. A check with the mailbox at the end of the drive, a battered tin rectangle bearing his name in black letters that had faded to prairie brown. He shrugged into a jacket and stepped out. The air was brittle. Frost stacked itself in delicate ribs on the hood of his truck. In the field beyond the ditch, a few stalks of Queen Anne's lace held their breath in lacework ice. Jack walked the ribbon of gravel as if it were a narrow bridge, eyes on the ground, by habit less sky, fewer surprises. He could hear the highway in the distance, a long sigh threaded with the cough of an engine that needed a new belt. At the mailbox he paused and thumbed the flag without raising it. The tin door stuck, then surrendered with a creak. Inside, 2 envelopes leaned against each other like tired men. One offered coupons he would never use. The other carried a careful, familiar hand. Riverton County Health. He knew the address without reading it twice. Riverton meant Emily. Jack took the envelope between his forefinger and thumb as if it might burn. For a breath, he didn't move. The paper felt too light. He slid his pocketknife along the top edge and drew out the single page. A routine notice patient reminder influenza clinic dates updated hours. At the bottom, a name in a clean font. Emily Turner, RN, Community Health, Riverton Clinic. The clinic's automatic print had done the work of saying what neither of them had said in years. She lived 20 miles south, blunt as a mile marker, and the county software thought he should know. He folded the page once, twice, then slipped it into his jacket. He stood by the crooked post while a truck he recognized by sound alone rolled past on Route 7. He didn't wave. The driver didn't look. The wind edged its way off the field and pressed a shoulder into his side, urging him back toward steel and heat. He obeyed. Inside the shop took him the way a good friend would not with questions, but with the mercy of tasks. He set the reminder under the magnet on the back of a drawer and pushed the drawer closed. Rule 3 held. He didn't speak. He let the grinder tell him what the day needed: a soft bite, a line of sparks, a smell like pennies. By mid-morning, frost had melted into a thin sheen along the loading dock, and small rivers ran toward the drain. The road into town would be wet, the potholes deeper. He had promised himself he wouldn't go today. He had coffee enough and a pantry that could make do, but acetylene didn't care about promises, and the tank's needle had wised up to his evasions. Around 11, he gave in. He shut the valves, checked the pilot, locked the side door, and pulled the main door until the latch found its seat. The truck coughed twice, then found its slow rhythm. He eased onto the county road, a cautious pilgrim, the shop's low silhouette slipping into his mirrors like a secret. Maple Ridge. If you asked, a map was a town assembled from a courthouse that saw more weddings than trials, a diner with a counter polished by 100 forearms, and a mill that once made the river sound like a promise. The mill stood empty now, its brick shoulder hunched against the wind-broken windows, winking with frost. People said a lot of things about that fire 5 years back. They said lightning. They said faulty wiring. They said the insurance board never looked too hard because the policy was thin and the owner had already decamped to Phoenix. The rumor that stuck, the one that clung like burrs to a wool coat, was a different kind, quieter and more useful to small-town talk. They said Jack Turner had a temper. They said sparks could travel. They said a man who liked to be alone had something to hide. Jack parked 2 blocks from Henderson's Hardware, where acetylene rentals were tallied on cards that still lived in a file drawer where the bell over the door rang like a memory. He preferred Henderson's because it kept things simple. You said what you needed, you handed over cash, and nobody offered you a loyalty card or a smile that didn't know where to land. The bell nodded above him as he stepped in. The heat inside carried sawdust and coffee. A woman in a thick sweater selected sandpaper by feel, running her fingers across the fine grit as if it were velvet. A man he'd seen 100 times and never met examined a coil of rope with a seriousness that felt like respect. Jack waited until the counter freed up. Henderson himself, filled to people who used his first name, looked up as if bracing for wind. "How you doing, Jack?" he said, the words set down carefully in a row. "Tank swap." "Yes, sir." Jack slid the rental card across. Phil stamped it with a wooden block that clacked like a small gavel. "Town meeting last night," Phil said, almost to the stamp. "They're still talking about the mill site. Some folks pressing the county to demo the rest. Might be a grant." Jack nodded because nodding was easier than speech. "You hear anything different?" Phil tried on the question like a jacket that might not fit. Jack shook his head. He could feel in that small hesitation how the rumor lived. It didn't need a speaker. It just needed the space left by someone who would not defend himself. Phil slid the receipt toward him and lowered his voice as if lowering a lamp wick. "Folks say things," he added, not unkindly. "Things settle if you give them time." Jack accepted the paper. Time settled some things. It also layered others until the weight would not let the door swing open. He carried the tank to the truck. On the way, he caught his reflection in a dark storefront, A man in a jacket with a clean seam line where a patch had once been eyes that went from smoke blue to tarnished pewter, depending on the light, a jaw set like a vice that had seen too many threads stripped. He remembered a different reflection barely older than a boy cheap mirror barracks on a base where the sun crawled into your mouth and dried the truth out of it. He had mailed pictures home then because you believed what a photograph could hold if you pressed it between pages. He had stopped taking pictures when he learned they could lie more neatly than words. At the corner, a couple stepped out of the diner. The woman recognized him and then decided in the space of a heartbeat to pretend she hadn't. The man glanced down the street to where the mill's roofline, broken and stubborn, leaned into the winter sky. Jack followed the glance, then turned away. He loaded the tank, tied it off, and started back. On the edge of town, he passed the turnoff to Riverton, 20 miles on a 2-lane road that ran past a frozen gravel pit and a billboard for a lawyer who blessed each client in a slogan that somehow felt both sincere and rehearsed. The thought arrived without invitation. A nurse in blue scrubs stepping out into the cold for a breath between patients, her hair pinned back the way her mother used to do it when mornings were still a private miracle. He let the thought pass. Rule 2. Do not invite ghosts. Back at the shop, the sun had softened just enough to cast warmer light along the bench. He hauled the tank inside and felt the air change as the door sealed behind him. He'd kept the shop austere on purpose, bare studs, concrete floor scrubbed to a consistent gray, and yet it betrayed him in small comforts he hadn't planned the chair near the furnace where he sat without thinking. The enamel mug that fit his hand as if it had learned him. He set the tank, tightened the chain, and stood listening. The place held a stillness he had taught it, but today that stillness had a new seam running through it, the thin paper seam of a clinic notice pinned in a drawer. He could pretend not to feel it. He had practice. He set a plate on the bench and began marking new cuts for an order that would take him 3 days and keep his hands busy. Outside, a breeze lifted then settled. A nail rolled in its tin. The clock's second hand swept with quiet determination. The stronghold held because that was what strongholds did. You built them to keep the world at a distance measured in inches, then feet, then years. But even good steel remembers every heat it has taken. Every mark tells you something about who you were when you made it. Jack set the chalk down and drew a breath that felt a shade lighter than the one before. He was not ready to admit it was because of a name on a page. He was not ready to admit anything at all. He adjusted the vise and braced the new bar. The torch answered. The day advanced by increments, each small enough to ignore and all of them adding up. Jack had returned from Henderson's with the acetylene tank secured in place, and the shop once again closed up tight behind him, the steel door sealing like the lid of a vault. The hours that followed returned to rhythm, the hum of the torch, the flash of sparks, and the quiet authority of steel bending under measured heat. The folded clinic notice with Emily's name remained hidden in the drawer, but its presence worked like a pebble in a boot, small yet impossible to forget. Jack pushed himself deeper into the comfort of routine sketching chalk lines across plates of metal, measuring twice, cutting once, until the smell of warmed iron began to chase away thought. By dusk, the November air pressed heavy against the walls, and he banked the furnace higher before stepping to the small side door. He cracked it open to breathe the cold in and remind himself that outside still existed. The sky was sinking into slate, and a thin line of orange bruised the horizon. It was then he heard it, a sound too sharp to be the wind, too soft to be a machine. Jack froze, listening. A scrape. A faint crunch of gravel near the edge of the yard. His first thought was raccoon or stray dog, something foraging among the metal scraps he kept piled near the back fence. He narrowed his eyes, scanned the dim line of trees, and held his breath. Then he heard it again, a shuffle that carried a rhythm no animal would make. Jack reached for the flashlight hanging by the door, thumbed the switch, and sent a clean beam cutting through the yard. The light caught a figure smaller than he expected standing by the stack of rusted rims. A child. The boy's jacket was too thin for the cold, his sneakers dark with mud, and his face pale in the beam. The boy looked about 7, maybe 8, with hair that stuck up at angles, his expression wide-eyed and startled, caught like a deer in headlights. Jack lowered the light a fraction so it would not blind him. "You lost?" His voice came out steady, the low gravel that years of silence had shaped. The boy shifted, clutching something against his chest, a worn baseball glove, the kind passed down more than bought. He didn't answer. Jack stepped forward 1 pace, keeping his movements measured. "Road's back that way," he said, tilting his head toward the lane. "You shouldn't be out here after dark." The boy's eyes darted to the steel shop behind Jack, to the looming shapes of twisted metal that stood like frozen sentinels in the yard, and then back to Jack's face. Jack knew what the boy saw, the deep scar along his temple, the hard set of his jaw, the man who never smiled when the town saw him. The boy's lip trembled. "My name's Jack." He tried softer this time. "What's yours?" The child took 1 small step backward. The gravel crunched louder in the cold. Jack stopped, careful not to close the space too fast. He remembered the way recruits used to look at him on his second tour after the blast, when half his face was a map of torn flesh and stubborn healing. He had grown used to it, then the look of hesitation of children gripping their mother's hands tighter at the grocery store, of strangers shifting lanes in the aisle. But the sting never fully dulled. "You okay?" he asked again, quieter. For a moment the boy seemed to consider, his eyes flitting to the open shop door where warmth and light spilled onto the concrete. But then the silence stretched and fear made the decision for him. The boy spun and bolted, feet slapping against gravel, the baseball glove dropping from his arms and bouncing once before landing in the dust. "Wait," Jack called, but the boy didn't look back. The small figure vanished into the tree line, swallowed by shadows, leaving only the sound of branches shaking in his wake. Jack stood still, the flashlight beam quivering slightly in his grip, until the quiet reclaimed the yard. He walked over to where the glove lay crouched and picked it up. The leather was worn thin, the stitching frayed, initials carved into the strap in clumsy block letters, SH. He turned it over once in his hand, then carried it into the shop. Inside, the furnace popped softly, the fire stretching. Jack set the glove on the workbench just beside the untouched coffee mug. It smelled faintly of dust and the sweat of play. He ran his thumb over the letters. S.H. Hayes. He knew the name. Hayes' family lived near the south end of town, across from the old train depot, a place where porches sagged and laughter was often too loud. Jack had seen the boy before, playing stickball in the street, chasing after a rubber ball with 2 other kids, while their mother called from the porch. Jack set the glove aside, sat on his stool, and stared at the open door where the boy had fled. The fear in the child's eyes had been sharper than the November air a mirror held up too suddenly. He felt the weight of it pressing on him, like the rumor of the mill fire, like every sideways glance in Henderson's store. He told himself it didn't matter. The boy was home by now. His parents would scold him for wandering, and the world would settle back into its grooves. Yet Jack couldn't shake the image of that trembling lip, the backward step, the final sprint into the dark. He banked the fire low, shut the doors tight, and tried to work, but each weld blurred into the memory of small footsteps on gravel. By midnight, he stood among his metal sentinels, their twisted forms casting long shadows against the concrete. They stared back at him in silence, guardians who knew too much. He thought of the rules he had written, the fortress he had built, and wondered when a child's eyes had become more dangerous than a storm. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the chair by the furnace until dawn pushed gray light across the floor, the glove still on the bench beside him. The glove lay on Jack's workbench for 2 full days, its worn leather a quiet accusation every time his eyes passed over it. He thought about carrying it into town, placing it on the Hayes porch, maybe knocking once before walking away, but each time the thought rose, he dismissed it. Too much risk of a face at the window of whispers that would carry by sundown. Instead, He told himself he would wait until he had a reason to drive into town again, and by then the boy might have forgotten. Yet, at night, when the furnace lowered to coals, the memory of the child's frightened eyes pulled at him more sharply than the winter wind pressing against the steel siding. On the third morning, as Jack carried a scrap bin toward the pile behind the shop, he stopped. Near the edge of the yard, half hidden in shadow, stood a dog. Its coat was patchy, a mottled mix of black and brown streaked with mud ribs visible through matted fur. It held its head low, ears pulled back, muscles tight, the posture of an animal ready to fight or bolt. Jack set the bin down slowly, his eyes never leaving the animal. "Easy," he said, his voice low and even. He crouched, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out the crust of bread he had planned to eat with his coffee. He held it out, letting the smell travel. The dog's eyes flicked from the bread to Jack's face, then back again. Instead of approaching it, gave a deep guttural growl, lips curling just enough to show yellowed teeth. Jack did not move. He knew that sound well. It was the voice of something that had been cornered before, something that had learned to survive by suspicion alone. He placed the bread gently on the ground and backed away step by slow step until he was near the shop door. The dog did not follow. It waited, watching him with sharp, assessing eyes. When Jack finally stepped inside and closed the door, he stood with his back against the cold steel for a long moment, listening. After several minutes, the growl faded into silence, and when he looked again, the bread was gone. That evening, the dog returned. It appeared at the far side of the yard as the light drained from the sky, pacing near the line of broken machinery. Jack left a small bowl of water near the door and half a can of beans in an old pan. He retreated inside, kept the door cracked, and waited. The dog approached, warily, sniffed the food, growled once more as if to make clear the terms of the arrangement, and then ate quickly before slipping back into the shadows. This pattern repeated for nearly a week. Each day the animal came closer. Each night its growls softened, though never disappeared entirely. Jack never tried to touch it, never raised his voice, never made sudden movements. He knew trust once broken was not repaired in a week. One afternoon, snow threatened in the sky, heavy clouds dragging low over the ridge. Jack stepped out with another scrap pan and saw the dog waiting by the woodpile. Its stance was still cautious, but its tail gave the smallest twitch of movement, uncertain but not hostile. Jack set the food down and straightened. "You're a stubborn one," he said. The dog lowered its head, sniffed, and began to eat. For the first time, Jack allowed himself to stand within 10 feet while it finished. As the animal lifted its head, Jack caught sight of something around its neck, a torn strip of leather half buried in fur. He squinted, stepped one pace closer. The dog stiffened, gave a warning growl but did not lunge. Jack held up his hands, palms out. "All right," he murmured. "Easy." He saw it then, the remnants of a collar cracked and worn with a faint metal tag still attached. The light caught just enough to show the letters, Wilson. Jack's chest tightened. Mr. Wilson had lived less than a mile down the back road in the old farmhouse with the leaning porch. The old man had died the previous winter alone. His body found only after days of silence when the snowplow driver noticed his driveway untouched. Jack remembered the ambulance lights on the road, the quiet murmur of neighbors shaking their heads, the whispers of regret. He had not known the man well, only enough to nod when they passed, but he remembered seeing him walk this very dog years younger, then its coat shining its steps proud. And now here it stood, a survivor of a year left to the wild, carrying the name of its lost master on a scrap of metal. Jack felt the weight of it, the symmetry of an abandoned man and an abandoned animal staring at each other across a yard of rust and silence. He crouched again, his voice low. "You're Wilson's, aren't you? Been on your own too long." The dog tilted its head, ears flicking as if the name carried an echo it could not place. For the first time, it did not growl. It simply stood chest rising and falling, watching him. Jack left the food and water as always, but that night he added an old blanket near the furnace side of the shop just inside the door. He did not coax the dog in, did not call. He simply left the door cracked and returned to his bench. Hours later, as the torch hissed and the sparks flew, he thought he heard the faintest shuffle of paws on concrete. He did not turn. He kept his hands steady on the steel, letting the animal make its own choice. By morning, the blanket carried the faint imprint of a body and a few strands of coarse fur. The dog was gone, but Jack felt a change in the air, a small breach in the fortress he had built so carefully. He looked at the bench where Sammy's glove still rested, initials carved into the strap, and then at the blanket by the stove. Two reminders of the world he had tried so hard to keep out now sat quietly inside his walls. The blanket near the furnace still held a faint curve in its fabric when Jack entered the shop that morning, though the dog had slipped away before dawn. The knowledge that the animal trusted his walls even for a few hours left him unsettled like a nail tapped loose inside a beam. He busied himself with new work, unwilling to sit too long with the thought, and turned to the corner where he kept discarded machines brought to him over the years, engines too stubborn to run. Again, farm equipment whose owners had long since given up. Among them sat an old portable generator, its frame bent, its casing rusted, but still holding the dignity of a machine that had once mattered. A farmer had dropped it off years earlier, promising to come back, but no one had, and Jack had pushed it against the wall to let time claim it. Now, with the early snow threatening, he decided it was worth pulling apart for salvage. He hauled it onto the workbench, brushing away dust, the smell of aged oil rising from its seams. The bolts resisted groaning under the wrench, but Jack coaxed them free. Inside the toolbox welded to the frame rattled faintly. He frowned, pried it open, and found not tools but a folded paper yellowed at the edges tucked beneath a layer of grime. He paused, wiping it against his sleeve, and the first shock came when he saw the handwriting across the fold. His father's. The bold, deliberate strokes of Henry Turner, a hand Jack had not seen in nearly 30 years. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he simply stared at it, feeling his pulse in his fingertips. Then he unfolded the page. The words were written with the plain sincerity of a man unused to flowery speech. Jack, I don't know if this will reach you. I've tried before. I failed you when you were young. I was hard when I should have listened. Your mother says you'll be home soon, and I want it to be different. I want to know you without uniforms between us. I want to sit across a table and not think about mistakes. If you'll let me, I'd like to start over before my time runs out. Jack read it twice, each line heavier than the last, the words pressing into old wounds like salt. He remembered the day he had come home from his second deployment, the way his family had stood in the living room debating his future as if he were invisible. The coldness of his father's gaze when their eyes had met. No apology, no softening. Yet here in his hands was proof that behind the silence had been an attempt, however late, at reconciliation. His chest tightened and he felt something he had not felt in years. Anger mixed with a grief so sharp it threatened to unsteady him. He folded the letter carefully, sat down on the stool, and stared at the steel wall as if it could answer. Why had he never seen this before? Who had hidden it? His mother? His brother, Mark? He thought of Emily, only a child at the time, and dismissed her from suspicion. The betrayal burned all the same. Someone had decided for him that his father's attempt should remain buried. Someone had taken from him the chance to choose whether to forgive. He rose, pacing the shop, the letter still in his grip. Each step echoed too loudly against the concrete. He imagined Henry writing it at the old oak table, his mother folding it into an envelope, his brother catching sight of it, and making a decision to tuck it away. Perhaps they had thought they were protecting him, sparing him the complication. Perhaps they had thought the war had made him too hard to care. But it wasn't their choice. The thought clawed at him, reopening every scar he had fought to weld shut. He looked at the sentinels he had built from metal scraps, twisted shapes that stood guard in silence, and realized they were all he had allowed himself to trust, because people, even blood, had proven too fragile, too deceitful. The furnace popped behind him, pulling him back. He forced himself to sit, laying the letter flat on the bench, smoothing it with his hand as though by doing so he could smooth the years it had lost. His mind turned to the old farmhouse down the road, to Mr. Wilson, who had died alone with no one to hear him call. Jack felt a kinship now, a recognition of how easily a life could shrink into silence. The dog had carried Wilson's name in a tag around its neck. Now Jack carried his father's in ink across a page. Both reminders had found their way to him uninvited, undeniable. The fortress he had built felt thinner with each one. He placed the letter in a tin box he kept on a high shelf, the box where he stored what little he considered too important to leave lying around. He locked it with a small padlock, though the gesture felt more symbolic than necessary. The words were already burned into him. That night he sat longer than usual by the furnace, staring at the door, half hoping the dog would return. It did, padding in quietly, curling on the blanket without a growl this time. Jack watched its sides rise and fall steady, as though it carried some unspoken truth in its breathing. He leaned back, let the warmth of the fire wash over him, and thought of his father's wish to start over. He wondered if such things were possible, or if time always moved too far ahead to let a man catch it. As sleep finally crept over him, the sound of the wind outside carried not menace but memory, and in that memory was the ache of words found too late. The letter from Henry remained locked in the tin box on the shelf, but Jack felt its presence in every quiet corner of the shop. Each time he reached for a tool or tightened a vise, his mind returned to the words his father had written, words stolen from him until it was too late. The dog, now more companion than intruder, slept most nights on the blanket near the furnace, its breathing a steady metronome against the restless hum of Jack's thoughts. By the end of the week, the pantry shelves had thinned. The coffee tin rattled with only a day's worth of grounds left, and the bin of canned soup stood nearly empty. Jack had postponed the trip into town for as long as he could, but necessity pressed him to load the truck and head down the ridge. The November air was sharp and the road slick with a thin crust of ice, but the old pickup held steady as he guided it toward Maple Ridge. The town looked much as it always did. A handful of cars outside the diner, the bell tower of the church cutting a gray outline against the sky storefronts, whose windows displayed wreaths and faded sale signs. Jack kept his head down as he parked near the gas station at the corner of Main, a place he used because it offered both fuel and the small market attached, allowing him to finish errands quickly and avoid lingering. He stepped out, adjusted his coat against the cold, and lifted the pump nozzle. As the gas flowed, he scanned the street without meaning to, old habits refusing to leave. That was when he noticed a man near the entrance, standing stiffly, his hand pressed to his chest. Jack recognized him vaguely, middle-aged, a face he had seen in town meetings years ago, perhaps a hardware clerk or a retired mill worker. The man staggered once, then collapsed onto the pavement, his body folding as though strings had been cut. For a moment, the scene froze. Two customers near the door gasped, but did not move. A clerk inside pressed against the glass, her mouth forming words without sound. Jack dropped the pump handle, crossed the distance in seconds, and knelt beside the man. The world around him receded. Training older than most of the bystanders' memories clicked into place. He checked airway first, tilting the head gently, listening for breath. Shallow, irregular. He pressed 2 fingers against the carotid artery. The pulse fluttered weakly, then faltered. Jack unzipped his coat, pulled the man's jacket open, and began compressions. The heel of his hand steady against the sternum. He counted under his breath, his voice low, his rhythm exact. After 30 compressions, he tilted the head back again, gave 2 breaths, then resumed. A woman cried out near the door, but Jack ignored it. His focus narrowed to the man beneath him, the fragile thread between breath and silence. After 2 cycles, the man's chest hitched a shallow gasp, rattling free. Jack checked the pulse again, stronger this time, though uneven. He turned his head slightly, called out with authority. "Call emergency services. Tell them male 50s, possible cardiac event, regained consciousness but unstable." His tone left no room for argument, and someone finally fumbled for a phone. The man's eyelids fluttered. Jack leaned close. "Stay with me," he said calmly. "Help is on the way. You're not alone." The words, simple as they were, carried weight even Jack could feel. Within minutes, sirens threaded through the air, growing louder until a red truck and an ambulance swung into the lot. Paramedics moved swiftly, sliding a stretcher beside the man. One knelt opposite Jack and nodded, recognizing at once the quality of the intervention. "Good work," the medic murmured as they lifted the man carefully onto the gurney. Jack stood, stepping back, brushing grit from his palms onto his coat. His breathing was steady, though his chest ached with the old echo of adrenaline. The bystanders, silent until now, shifted their eyes between the ambulance crew and the tall, scarred man who had appeared to know exactly what to do. Whispers began soft but carrying. The clerk at the glass door spoke to another customer, her hands gesturing toward Jack with a mix of astonishment and relief. He felt the weight of their gazes like stones pressing against his shoulders. He retrieved his forgotten gas receipt, finished filling the tank, and returned to the truck without a word. Yet, as he pulled onto Main Street, he caught in the rearview mirror the faces still turned toward him, not with suspicion this time, but with something closer to respect, or at least bewildered reconsideration. The road back up the ridge felt both heavier and lighter. He had not sought to prove anything, yet the moment had laid bare a truth the town had not expected. The man they called a recluse, the one whispered about in the diner, had knelt on cold pavement and brought a neighbor back from the edge. Jack parked the truck at the shop, unloaded the supplies, and leaned against the workbench for a long while, the hum of the furnace filling the silence. He glanced at the glove still resting there, at the tin box on the shelf, at the blanket by the stove. Pieces of the world he had tried to keep out were gathering inside his walls, uninvited yet insistent. He ran a hand over his scarred temple and exhaled slowly. The fortress had held for years, but now the cracks were showing, and through those cracks, the world was beginning to see him differently. After the day at the gas station, the air in town had shifted. Jack had not returned to hear it, but whispers traveled faster than roads, and even high on the ridge he could sense that something had changed. The next morning, when he stepped outside, the silence no longer felt like exile, but like a pause before another sound. It was the dog who made that sound first. Instead of keeping its distance, it followed him along the yard as he carried wood from the stack to the furnace bin. It kept several paces back, its ears alert, its body still cautious, but it moved when he moved, stopped when he stopped, and waited near the door each time he disappeared inside. By evening, Jack found himself leaving the door open a fraction longer, the blanket near the stove smoothed as though in invitation. The dog did not come closer than the threshold, but its eyes tracked him with something that resembled trust, however fragile. That trust seemed to grow with the days. Jack caught the animal shadowing him on the tree line when he walked the perimeter of the property, as if patrolling in tandem. He began to expect its presence to look for the flick of an ear or the glint of fur. It did not feel like ownership. It felt like companionship in its most basic, wordless form. Then one evening, when the sky had begun to drop its first snowflakes, the dog did not appear. Jack waited by the door longer than usual, listening for the familiar shuffle, but only the wind answered. He told himself the animal was hunting farther out, that it would return by dawn. Yet when morning came, the blanket was still untouched. A day passed, then another, and unease grew in him like a stone. On the third night, he took a lantern and walked beyond the yard, his boots sinking into drifts along the trail toward the northern trees. He called softly once or twice, not the animal's name. He had never given it one, but a low whistle he knew it recognized. No sound returned. It was nearly midnight when he caught it, faint but distinct, a whine, high-pitched, strained, carried by the cold air. He pushed toward it, weaving between pines, until the beam of his lantern swept over a form huddled low near the ground. The dog lay on its side, panting, its back leg caught in the jaws of a steel trap staked into the frozen soil. Jack's chest clenched as he knelt beside it. The metal teeth had bitten deep fur matted with blood where the struggle had been fiercest. The dog's eyes rolled toward him, not with the suspicion of their first meetings, but with desperation, a silent plea. Jack set the lantern down, muttering steady words, though he knew the animal did not need the syllables so much as the tone. "Easy now, I've got you, hold still." He examined the trap, his fingers remembering every hinge, every cruel angle. The mechanism was unmistakable. It was the same spring-loaded design he had been issued overseas, used not only for animals, but for holding perimeters where footsteps were unwelcome. Seeing it here in Vermont soil was like stumbling into a memory he had fought to bury. He swallowed hard, the frost burning in his lungs. With a practiced motion, he braced the trap, pressed the jaws apart, and freed the mangled leg. The dog whimpered, tried to stand, then collapsed against him, trembling. Jack wrapped his coat around its body, cradling the weight against his chest, and for a moment he could not separate the battlefield from the forest, the soldier from the man. The trap lay open in the snow, its teeth gleaming, a ghost of war resurrected where it had no place. Jack carried the animal back through the woods, each step heavy with the knowledge that violence was not confined to deserts or cities, oceans away. It lived here too, in the hands of someone willing to lay steel jaws in the dark for any creature to find. Back at the shop, he laid the dog gently on the blanket, stoked the furnace high, and cleaned the wound with water warmed over the stove. He bound it with strips of cloth torn from an old flannel, his hands steady even as memory clawed at him. The dog did not resist. It lay still, watching him with eyes that had once held only mistrust, but now carried something deeper, a quiet acceptance. Jack sat back when the bandage was secure, his own breath ragged. He turned the trap over in his lap, its design as familiar as any tool of his trade. He thought of the men he had known who trusted such devices, who believed safety was worth cruelty. And now, here in his own woods, the war had found its echo. He set the trap aside far from the furnace and let the fire's glow bathe the room. Outside, the storm thickened, snow falling heavy, but inside the silence was broken by the soft sound of the dog's breathing alive against the odds. Jack leaned against the wall, staring at the scarred animal stretched before the stove. The war he had tried to leave behind had followed him in iron teeth and bloodied fur, reminding him that some battles did not belong to distant years, but to every place a man carried his scars. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in many nights, he whispered aloud to the empty room, "Not here, not again." The words were not a command, but a vow. The dog healed slowly, favoring its leg, but learning to place weight again each day, stretching farther from the blanket near the stove and closer to the yard where snow piled against the machines. Jack grew accustomed to its presence, to the rhythm of feeding, cleaning, and watching over it. He found himself speaking aloud in quiet moments, not expecting response, yet finding comfort in the simple act of forming words for another living thing. The trap remained in the corner, a dark reminder he had yet to decide how to dispose of, but its presence made him vigilant. It was in the midst of this fragile routine, one late afternoon, when the furnace hummed and the dog dozed near the fire, that a knock came at the steel side door. Jack stiffened instantly, his body rising with the same instinct that had carried him through ambushes years ago. He glanced toward the dog, whose ears lifted, then crossed the shop in slow, measured steps. Visitors were almost unheard of. He pulled the heavy latch, braced his shoulder, and swung the door open. There, framed against the gray sky and falling snow, stood Emily, his daughter. Her hair was tucked under a knitted cap, her coat buttoned high, her gloved hands clutching a leather folder. She was older than the last time he had seen her face more defined, her eyes carrying a weight he recognized as life's own sharpening. For a long moment neither spoke. Jack's voice, when it came, was rough from disuse. "Emily." She nodded, her breath visible in the cold. "I need to talk to you," she said, her tone steady but guarded. He stepped aside reluctantly, and she entered, her eyes sweeping across the shadowed sculptures and the warm glow of the furnace. The dog raised its head but did not growl, only watched her carefully. She moved closer to the fire as if needing its heat for the words she carried. "I didn't come for memories," she began, glancing briefly at him. "I came because there's paperwork. The land. It's still in your name, part of it. We've had an offer and we need your signature to sell." Jack felt the words land like blows. Of all the reasons she could have come, this was the one. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, but business. He folded his arms, the scar on his temple catching the light. "You want to sell this place?" Emily shook her head quickly. "Not the shop. The acreage down by the creek. It's valuable now with developers looking. Uncle Mark says it's the smart thing to let it go before the taxes drown us." At the mention of Mark, Jack's jaw tightened. "Mark," he repeated flatly. Emily hesitated, then pulled the folder open, sliding papers onto the workbench. Legal language covered the sheets, signatures already lining the bottom except for the final one. Jack did not touch them. His eyes stayed fixed on her face. "Why now?" he asked quietly. Emily's shoulders slumped. She looked away, her voice softening. "Because everything they've said about you, everything they've whispered, it started with him. The fire at the mill. The blame that never left you. It wasn't just rumor. Uncle Mark planted it. He said you caused it, said you left something burning, but the truth was, he had debts. He needed someone to carry the weight, and you weren't here to defend yourself. People believed him because they wanted to." The furnace popped sharp in the silence that followed. Jack stood motionless, his thoughts tearing open old wounds with new blades. He had lived 2 decades under the shadow of accusation the Iron Man blamed for recklessness for destruction, and all the while, it had been his own brother's lie, a mask for his failures. He turned from Emily, his hand gripping the edge of the workbench until his knuckles whitened. She spoke again, her voice trembling now. "I didn't know until recently. I heard him talking, and he admitted it to me like it was nothing. He said you were already an outcast, that it didn't matter. But it does matter. You should know." Jack released the bench, exhaling slowly, the breath heavy with restraint. He looked at her, at the daughter who stood there holding not reconciliation but a choice, a demand for his hand on paper tied to the very man who had buried him in rumor. He felt the heat of the furnace, the weight of his father's letter in the tin box, the presence of the dog at his feet, and realized the past was not just echoing, but standing in his workshop, demanding response. He did not take the pen. He did not sign. He simply said, "I'll think about it." Emily nodded, gathering the papers back into the folder with hands that shook slightly. She moved toward the door, pausing once to glance at him. For the first time that evening, her voice carried something softer, almost vulnerable. "I came because I had to, but also because part of me wanted to see if you were still here." She opened the door and stepped into the snow. Jack watched her go, the weight of her words pressing harder than the cold. He closed the door gently, leaning against it, his pulse steady but his heart fractured in ways he thought long calcified. The dog pressed closer to his leg, silent, offering the only loyalty he could count on. Jack stared into the fire and understood the fortress was no longer just cracked. It had been breached by blood, by betrayal, by the truth finally dragged into light. The snow had been falling for 2 days without pause, burying the ridge beneath a white silence so deep even the dog refused to wander far from the furnace. Jack stacked wood higher, listening to the wind scour the steel siding, each gust whistling like a memory of places he would rather forget. Emily's visit lingered like smoke in his chest, her words about Mark twisting tighter with each hour. He worked longer into the nights, hammering, welding, shaping steel until sparks blurred his vision. On the 3rd evening, the storm thickened into something greater, a full nor'easter sweeping across the valley. The lights in his shop flickered once, twice, then steadied. But Jack knew what that meant. Down in town, weaker lines would already be falling. He stoked the furnace, poured coffee into his chipped mug, and sat listening to the roar outside. The knock startled him. Not the hesitant tap of Emily's visit, but a firm, deliberate strike that carried authority. The dog bristled ears high, but did not growl. Jack opened the door against the wind and found a man bundled in a heavy fireman's coat, his hat dusted with snow. He recognized him at once, Tom Miller, the fire chief of Maple Creek, a man known in passing, rarely encountered this high on the ridge. Tom's face was set in lines of urgency, his voice raised above the gale. "Jack, we need your help. The power's down across the valley. The nursing home's generator failed. We've got people inside cold and fragile, and no one else knows how to get the backup running. They said you might." Jack's first instinct was to refuse the walls of his shop, pulling him back toward solitude. He opened his mouth to say as much, but then he pictured the residents of that home. People as old as his father would have been wrapped in blankets against a dark that grew colder with every hour. He exhaled, slow and resigned. "Give me 10 minutes, he said. He pulled on his heavy coat, checked his tool bag with the same precision he once gave to his pack, and followed Tom down to the truck idling in the drive. The ride into town was slow snow clawing at the windshield, the headlights carving narrow tunnels through white. Jack said nothing, but Tom glanced at him more than once, measuring the man who had lived like a rumor for years. They arrived at the nursing home, its windows black, the shape of bundled figures visible inside by flashlight beams. Jack shouldered his bag and stepped through the doors. The air inside was frigid, the residents wrapped in coat staff, moving anxiously with too little effect. One nurse looked up, startled to see him. "That's Jack Turner," she whispered, as if uncertain whether to trust her own eyes. Jack ignored it. He went straight to the basement, Tom close behind. The backup generator sat hulking in the corner, silent and lifeless, its casing streaked with rust. Jack set his bag down, opened the panel, and traced the wiring with methodical precision. His hands worked steady, his breath visible in the cold. "Fuel lines clogged," he said finally, his tone firm. "Filters are choked battery nearly dead. It'll need more than luck." He rolled up his sleeves, his muscles moving with a rhythm drilled long ago, and set to work. For over an hour, he bled the line, cleaned the filter with kerosene, checked connections, and improvised replacements from scraps in his kit. Tom watched, impressed, offering tools when asked, but otherwise silent. At last, Jack closed the panel, flipped the switch, and the generator coughed once, twice before roaring to life. The lights overhead flickered on, casting the basement in steady glow. Upstairs, a cheer rose from staff and residents alike as heat began to return to the building. Jack replaced his tools, wiped his hands, and moved toward the stairs, but Tom stopped him. "It's not just the machine," he said. "The team's short-staffed. We need hands to keep things stable through the night." Jack hesitated, then nodded once. Hours passed. He hauled blankets, adjusted heaters, checked the generator every half hour, and gave instructions to volunteers who had little idea how to manage equipment. Residents warmed slowly, their color returning. A frail man in a wheelchair gripped Jack's hand at one point, whispering a shaky thank you before being wheeled away. Jack simply nodded, the weight of the gesture heavier than any medal he had ever been handed. By dawn, the storm began to break. The generator still thrummed the building, still warm, the people safe. Jack stood by the window, watching the snow ease into a lighter fall, his body exhausted but steady. Tom approached, his expression unreadable, but his voice carrying quiet respect. "You led them tonight, Jack. You didn't have to, but you did. Don't think folks will forget that." Jack looked away down at the snow-laden streets, his reflection caught faintly in the glass. He said nothing, but deep inside he felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but the faint recognition that the world outside his fortress had seen a part of him he had kept buried, and for once it had not turned away in fear. The storm had passed, leaving Maple Creek buried beneath white drifts and bright silence. The nursing home's lights glowed steadily now, the hum of the repaired generator carrying through the night, a sound that would stay in Jack's mind longer than he admitted. He returned to his shop, exhausted but strangely restless, and the dog padded after him, limping less with each day. In town, he knew whispers had already changed shape again. This time not about the Iron Man who burned down a mill, but about the man who had brought light back during the storm. Jack told himself it meant nothing. The fortress still stood. The past was still heavy. Yet he also knew the cracks were widening. Days later, a sharp rapping came at the door, louder, quicker. Not the respectful knock of Tom Miller, nor the tentative touch of Emily. Jack opened it to find his brother Mark. The sight struck him harder than the storm had. Mark stood hunched against the wind, his coat threadbare, his face gaunt, eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Mark stepped inside without invitation, his voice raw with urgency. "Jack, I need your help." Jack stiffened, closing the door slowly. "Help," he repeated each syllable cold. Mark's hands trembled as he rubbed them together. "It's bad. Debt's worse than before. I've got people after me, and if I don't find a way out, they'll take everything. I thought I could handle it, but—" His voice cracked, and he sank onto the stool near the furnace, staring at the floor. Jack watched him with eyes hard as iron. "You came to me," he said quietly. "After what you did." Mark flinched, unable to meet his gaze. "I didn't think it would last this long. I thought the fire story would fade. You weren't here, and people needed someone to blame. He faltered, swallowed hard. "I was desperate." Jack's hand tightened on the edge of the workbench, every muscle in him straining against the weight of 2 decades of disgrace. He wanted to lash out, to demand why, to unleash the fury that had lived inside since the first whisper reached his ears. But instead he stood still, the dog pressing quietly against his leg as if sensing the storm inside. At last Jack spoke, his tone low but steady. "You want my help, Mark? Then you'll give me something first. You'll stand in front of the town and tell them the truth. Every word. That the fire wasn't mine. That you lied." Mark's head shot up, his face pale. "I can't," he whispered. "They'll turn on me. I'll lose everything." Jack's eyes did not waver. "You've already lost. The only thing left is your honesty. Without that, I give you nothing." Silence stretched long in the furnace glow. Mark's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. He knew his brother meant every word. Jack turned away, pacing once across the floor. The anger had not vanished, but it had hardened into something else, resolve. He would not let vengeance chain him further. He would not become the lie that had been cast on him. He looked back at Mark. "If you tell the truth, I'll help you. Not before." Mark's mouth opened closed, then finally he nodded, a single broken gesture of surrender. Jack reached for the old tin box on the shelf, pulled it down, and laid Henry's letter on the bench. He slid it toward Mark. "Read it," he said. Mark scanned the page. his face tightening with each line. When he finished, his hand lingered on the paper, trembling. "You should have seen this years ago," Jack said. "But you didn't, because someone decided I didn't deserve it. You stole more than reputation, Mark. You stole time. That ends now." Mark closed his eyes, the weight of both letter and demand pressing into him. He whispered, "All right, I'll tell them." Jack took back the letter, returned it to the tin, and shut it with finality. The dog shifted on the blanket, its gaze fixed on the two brothers. Jack exhaled long and heavy. "Tomorrow," he said. "We go together. And this time, no lies." The following morning dawned clear after days of storm, the snowbanks glittering beneath a pale winter sun. Jack had not slept, though his body had longed for it. Mark had gone back to town with the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders, leaving Jack in the quiet forge with only the dog and the faint hum of wind for company. He moved through his workshop with steady hands, not to weld or to grind, but to uncover a piece he had worked on through countless sleepless nights. A figure of steel he had named the Night Watcher. Built from scraps and fragments that once lay forgotten, its posture was strong yet weary, a silent sentinel shaped in the image of endurance itself. When Tom Miller appeared later that day, his voice carried both formality and respect. "Jack," he said, brushing snow from his jacket. "The town is holding a gathering tomorrow on the green. We'd like you to come. Bring one of your works. People should see what you've built." Jack almost refused out of instinct, the old resistance rising in his chest. But the memory of Mark's broken voice and the quiet certainty that truth was finally about to breathe again stilled his protest. Instead, he nodded once. "I'll bring it." The next day, he loaded the Night Watcher onto his old truck, with the same care he once gave to equipment that carried men's lives. The drive into town felt different this time. The stares from the sidewalks were not sharp or suspicious, but cautious, curious, tinged with something almost like anticipation. The green had been cleared of snow, trampled down by boots and laughter, a crowd already gathered in coats and scarves. Banners fluttered against the cold sky, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke. With Tom's help, Jack and two other men hoisted the tarp-covered figure onto the plinth at the center of the green. The crowd hushed as the canvas came away, revealing the sentinel of twisted steel and scarred iron. The figure stood tall, though bent-forged from remnants, yet undeniably human in its stance, one arm lifted as though holding invisible watch against the storm. For a long moment there was only silence, the townsfolk staring as if confronted with both a mirror and a monument. Then slowly applause broke the quiet, scattered at first, then rising into a steady, genuine ovation. Jack stood a step back. His arms crossed his face, unreadable, but his heart pounded at the sound. It was not the false clapping of politeness. It was the acknowledgement of something they saw and finally understood. The man they had feared had been a craftsman all along, shaping from ruin not monsters, but guardians. Emily stood at the edge of the crowd, her face pale in the winter light, her eyes fixed on her father. When the applause subsided and people began to murmur again, some approaching to ask about the work, she walked slowly toward him. She stopped close enough for him to feel her presence, but not so close that the gesture felt forced. For several long seconds, neither spoke. Then Emily lifted her hand and laid it gently on his arm, tentative but steady. Jack did not pull away. He looked at her, and the silence between them filled with all the words neither could find. At last he gave a small nod, not of forgiveness spoken, but of acceptance lived. Emily blinked, her eyes glistening, and withdrew her hand only when the moment no longer needed holding. The evening waned, and Jack returned to his truck with the Night Watcher still standing on the plinth, guarded by the townspeople who lingered around it. He did not look back as he drove away, the dog resting against the seat, but for the first time in years, his shoulders did not carry the weight of exile. The following morning, as he stepped outside to split firewood, he heard the crunch of tires on the frozen drive. Emily's car pulled up its trunk, holding a single small suitcase. She stepped out, her breath visible in the cold, and gave him a look that carried both uncertainty and determination. "I thought," she said softly, "I might stay a few days. If that's all right." Jack studied her, the silence stretching like the fields of snow around them. He said nothing, but he turned, carried his tools to the side of the shop, and retrieved an old wooden chair that had long gathered dust in the corner. He brought it onto the porch and set it beside his own. Emily's eyes softened, and she smiled faintly. The dog wagged its tail once and lay at their feet. For the first time in years, the house on the ridge no longer belonged to one man alone. It belonged to the possibility of two, with room enough for healing to begin. That was the journey of Jack Turner in the quiet town of Maple Creek, where storms, scars, and truth reshaped a man the world had forgotten. Now, I'd love to hear from you what part of his story struck you the most. Was it the moment he pulled the wounded dog from the snow, the letter from his father, or the final quiet gesture of his daughter? And tell us, where are you watching from today? Your reflections mean a lot, so share them in the comments. If you'd like to follow more stories like this one, remember to like the video and subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next.